Hello everyone, and welcome to what is the second episode of our Embracing the Moment webinar series. The purpose of these webinars is to equip each and every one of you with some practical guidance that you can apply in this constantly changing, often volatile and increasingly unpredictable world that we currently find ourselves living and working in, with the focus being on how to thrive rather than just survive in the current climate. In our previous webinar, we began looking at change, in particular, making the transition from student and university life into the world of work. We were joined by a number of excellent speakers from the world of graduate employment, academia, and one of our very own branch managers here from Enterprise Rent-A-Car, who all shared their very honest and insightful stories on how they have coped with change throughout their careers to date. Today will be no different, as we are joined again by three more excellent speakers, all experts in their fields and all giving up their own time to offer their ideas, support and experiences, all in the name of helping you perform to the best of your ability, both inside and outside of work during these challenging times. My name is Paul Hanrahan, and I will be your host for the session today, which will be looking at resilience. Resilience is something that every graduate employer is seeking. It is one of those soft, transferable or employability skills that we all have to demonstrate when interviewing, and likewise must develop further to deal with the bumps that come along the way in any career or in life in general. But what does it mean to be resilient? How do you know if you are resilient? How can you develop resilience without first having been through some form of hardship? When it comes to interviewing, what sort of examples are prospective employers looking for during an interview? All great questions, and all which we will attempt to answer during this next hour. And we will be doing that through a keynote speech and a panel discussion. If you're new to Zoom, make sure that you use the little three dots next to your name to make sure that it's your name that appears on the screen and that it updates. As we go through, if you have any questions or if you would like to ask a particular question to any of our panelists, please put this in the chat box. And please also, as you go through, feel free to engage with us on social media and through some of the links that we're going to be sharing as well. But without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the first of our speakers, Dr. Matthew Smith from Buckinghamshire New University. Matthew is going to use the next 15 minutes or so to talk to you about luck, the part that it plays in our everyday lives, how you can influence it, and how you can positively affect, or how it can positively affect your resilience and subsequently your career. Over to you, Matthew.
So I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully now you can see my slides. Hope that's the case. So good evening. Thanks for the introduction, Paul. Appreciate it and lovely to be here and be part of this evening's session. So my name is Matthew Smith. My background is in psychology. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. The title of the talk, the title of the brief presentation is going to be Go Luck Yourself, because what I'm interested in here is particularly how psychology can help us with, well, I've said here, the challenges of finding your ideal career, but particularly then some of the ideas in terms of dealing with both good and bad luck, and we will explore what we might mean by luck, and we'll take us through this idea to what we might mean by resilience, which we'll pick up hopefully in the discussion after the talk. So in terms a little bit about myself, so I'm based at Buckinghamshire New University, and we have a Centre for Positive Psychology. And in many ways, what that represents is an ongoing master's course, where there's actually quite a lot of work we're doing around positive psychology in different ways, but it emerged out of a master's in applied positive psychology. In fact, this year will be the 10th year of this course, and we attract students from all over the world to explore ways in which psychology can help us understand, in some ways, what makes life worth living, the best of in life, strengths, happiness, resilience, again, hope. These are all topics we'll explore on the course. And what I'm particularly interested in is how some of these ideas may link to what we might describe as luck. So we're going to talk a bit more about what we might mean by luck. In terms of the next 15 minutes, the plan is to give you a bit of an overview of what we might mean by luck. So even now, even if I get into that, if people want to start, if you find your way to the chat, and if you want to type in maybe 3 words that you associate with luck, that gets us started in terms of thinking the kinds of things people think about when thinking about luck. We will explore some of these as we go through. We'll particularly then explore what we might mean in terms of the role of luck in career development. So again, many of the people viewing may well be students just finishing their studies and moving into working life. So again, this recognition that sometimes the career progression isn't that smooth route we often perceive it might be. There's lots of ups and downs along the way, and how we navigate those is going to be really important. So in terms of psychology, one of my interests is to what extent can we tame luck, or in some ways can we influence it in some ways. We'll explore those ideas, particularly from a psychological perspective, and then see if we can apply these in terms of one's own career. So that's the plan. And we're going to bring ideas together from different places. So I mentioned luck a couple of times there. Well, one of the reasons why I'm interested in this is in terms of my own PhD work, which was conducted back in the day. In fact, it was last century, completed in 1998. The full title is Perceptions of One's Own Luck. Just about to see it on this image on screen. The formation, maintenance of consequences of perceived luckiness. Because PhD titles always have to have quite lengthy, clever sounding names. But basically, the psychology of luck. As I've just said, drawing upon ideas from positive psychology. So particularly things like gratitude, optimism. We'll look at some of those in a little bit more detail in a moment. And also just touching upon some ideas that even the last few years have now come into careers counselling. So two examples here. One is called the chaos theory of careers. And also there's a book called Luck is No Accident. And the subtitle you should make up there is Making the Most of Happenstance in Your Life and Career. So increasingly people who maybe counsel others on developing one's own career are recognizing, again, the more in which we're able to draw upon and learn from those experiences, which may seem as though they're completely outside of our control, maybe that's a really important part of our own career development. So these important ideas as well. So the first question is, and again, I've asked you to maybe start typing into the chat. If people want to just type any words that come into their mind as they think of the word luck. Here's a dictionary definition. A nice place to start into defining luck. So just read through here. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary. Success or failure apparently brought by chance rather than through one's own actions, and chance considered as a force that causes good or bad things to happen. So even here, it's almost regarding chance as being something, is even a force in itself. I'm interested again, I'd love people, if they do have access to the chat, to just type in, there's one word in particular from this definition that draws my attention. So before I tell you the one I'm thinking of, maybe just type in the chat, there's one word that you're drawn to on this particular definition, particularly the first part, the bit where it goes from success or failure, apparently brought by chance rather than through one's own actions. If there's any words that draw your attention, I can't actually see what's coming through at the moment, but I'm curious. I'll give you a slight clue to the one that I'm quite interested in here. If it's not completely obvious, a few more pointers, literally, it's the word apparently. See, this is actually from the dictionary, the success or failure apparently brought by chance. That means I think we've got a bit of wiggle room here. So maybe things that look as though they're down to chance are some of these events, things in which we maybe have some influence. So that's what we're going to explore. In terms of traditional work by psychologists, when you look back into work even from the 1970s and before that, and even still, many psychologists would traditionally assume that luck has three properties of some sort. Effectively, it's external to us, so it's outside of us, nothing to do with me personally, it's outside of me. It's unstable, so that means it may be that you might have experienced some good luck today, but next time it'll be bad luck, so it's not something that's particularly stable over time. And it's also uncontrollable, so it's outside of our control. So that would be the typical assumption what we might mean by luck. But what I found from my research in terms of the PhD, even one of the initial findings, was that's not how people typically think of luck. They may think of luck as being, to some extent, internal, maybe something about themselves, therefore stable over time. So if you're lucky today, you may continue to be lucky into the future, and maybe to some extent controllable. So people sometimes see luck as being controllable. And a nice simple example of that is, imagine just the phrase, if somebody says, I'm a lucky person. So if you think yourself, I'm a lucky person, then you're suggesting it's internal, something about you, stable over time, and maybe even controllable. So we're going to explore these ideas a little bit more. But first of all, we're going to try a little thought experiment. So first of all, allow your mind to go blank. That was quick. But here's a particular phrase I want you to think about. So just imagine as a thought experiment, you're waiting in a bank when an armed robber enters into the bank and fires a shot, and the bullet hits you in the arm. Now, would you describe that as lucky or unlucky? So again, feel free to use the chat if you want to say just simply lucky or unlucky. If you want to give more of an explanation of why you might think that, because what I think is interesting is that when you ask this to a group of people, you typically find that not everybody always agrees. So have a look at what's coming through in the chat, see if everybody's saying the same thing or not. If we had more time, we maybe get a few more questions. Maybe in the panel session after, we can ask a bit more about why people might think it's been lucky or unlucky. Because the nice thing is it differs, people have different opinions. The idea with this is that sometimes we can describe ourselves as being lucky or unlucky simply by comparison. So if you imagine, basically it's what psychologists might call counterfactual thinking. So you're comparing what has actually happened with what you imagine might have happened. So if you're reading from these people who thought, well, that's really quite unlucky because that's a negative thing to have happened, you wouldn't want it to happen, no one would say that. But if there's anybody in the chat who said, well, I think it's maybe lucky, I suspect to some extent they may be thinking, well, it could have easily been a shot that hits me in the head, therefore I would have been killed. In the arm, it's not so bad. You know, you can imagine how things could have been worse. And that's a classic way in terms of people might think themselves being lucky. So sometimes if we can engage in that kind of thinking, we can actually still think ourselves as being relatively lucky compared to how it might have happened if we can imagine things being worse. Here's a nice example of one where I gave a talk along these lines a few years ago, and somebody sent me this picture after the talk saying, well, I think this illustrates your point quite nicely. So here, this is a shot. I think if I use my cursor, you might be able to see the car has been coming along the road from this angle. Hoping you see my cursor, come through the barrier here, flipped over and gone to the other side, have landed here, and the person was relatively uninjured. So you think that's relatively lucky, particularly if I go to the next shot, which is a pullback. It's the same shot. In fact, that's what we just saw up there, is that car having come through the barrier, and then you can see how very close it came to falling a very big distance down into that canyon. So there you imagine the person may say, that's a great example of how lucky would that be. You'd imagine quite easily you could have fallen down into the canyon and you'd have been a goner. So again, comparing to how things might have been is one example of how I might perceive as lucky or unlucky. So we talked a little bit about making your own luck, or this idea of to what extent is luck as controllable, because some people definitely believe that, and we can explore whether that is the case. So a very clear reference here to the work of Richard Wiseman. So he's now Professor Richard Wiseman. And again, it's no coincidence in terms of I'm drawing upon Richard's work because Rich was my PhD supervisor. So the work I did back in the 1990s was with Richard. He went on to do some more work, published this book. And in fact, if you are going to go and look for Richard's book called The Luck Factor, whilst I said here there's a book that's 2003, I'd actually say there's another version in 2004, a second edition, which again, the covers may have changed more recently, but it's in that version where there's mention of something called luck school, which I'll say a bit more about in a second. So again, the book's a really interesting read. It's a nice example of consolidating some of the research we did over a few years. But in essence, what Richard was arguing is if you look at people who perceive themselves to be lucky, generally lucky people, they tend to draw upon these kinds of principles. So they will actually engage in things to maximize chance opportunities. Again, something we'll pick up more in a second. So recognizing much of what happens to us in life may well be down to chance or have that element to it. How can we maximize them? How can we capitalize upon them? To what extent should we listen to our hunches? So do you rely on your intuitions? Again, lucky people, or people who perceive themselves to be lucky, tend to listen to their hunches. They tend to also expect good fortune. They expect things to go well. And that may well be what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you expect things to go well, you engage in behaviors, even if they're things that you don't always influence what's going on, but you may have a slight nudge on something. So therefore, even expecting good fortune has a real impact. And also we'll explore, again, very relevant in terms of around resilience. To what extent can we turn bad luck into good luck? And we've already touched upon it in terms of when people imagine how things might have been worse. It's just one example of how we might turn bad luck into good luck. And what Richard did is that part of this in the second book, had some people take part in what he called luck school to see if you apply these principles, did you see a change in people's luck? That's exactly what he reports in the book. And it's this idea I've been keen to sort of build upon really with Go Luck Yourself. Of these principles we can all apply, or variations of them, that may influence our own experiences of luck. I mentioned before I also wanted to draw briefly on some of the careers counselling literature. So here's two particular examples. The chaos theory of careers, and here basically just arguing that careers themselves tend to reflect chaotic systems. And we might describe things like the butterfly effect. And often we describe it in terms of weather, where allegedly even just the flutter of a butterfly's wings in one part of the world may well have an impact on a storm on the other side of the world. Sounds implausible, but when you look at real world events, very small actions can have quite big impact. So look at maybe your own life where such a small decision has actually had quite a big impact. We'll be interested to see where those ideas come across when we look at issues of resilience. And planned happenstance, the book is Luck is No Accident, suggests again, recognizing you will have unplanned events, what can we do to make the most of them? So there's even ideas within careers counselling, which we can draw upon here. What I'm most interested in the final few moments, just saying a bit about the role of positive psychology. I said it was something that I was particularly interested in. These elements of positive psychology aren't all of positive psychology. There's lots of other things that positive psychologists would look at, but I would argue these are all important in terms of helping you draw upon psychology to improve your own luck, or at least your experiences we describe as being luck. So to what extent we can cultivate positive emotions, expressing gratitude and optimism, that's something we'll touch more in a second. Mindfulness is very helpful in terms of us bringing us down to a way of seeing the world around us, maybe noticing opportunities, and again, to what extent can we build resilience? Something we'll pick up more, I think, in the panel discussion. So I have been talking about this idea of go luck yourself. It's basically 5 principles, I think, here, and I will actually point you to, I'll put in the chat, maybe when I finish speaking, a link to a LinkedIn group where you can engage with some of these ideas yourselves. But one of the first ideas will be embracing luck, recognizing luck and chance, whatever else you want to describe it, as an important part of so many things that happen to us. The more we can embrace that, we might be able to engender what's called a good luck mindset. So I talked a moment ago, very briefly, I mentioned gratitude and optimism. So gratitude very much goes in tune with luck. You might feel as though people describe themselves being lucky when they're grateful for something. Combine that with optimism, expecting things to go well. You're more likely to be in that kind of good luck mindset. You're more likely to be able to create opportunities and notice opportunities when they arise. So we can talk a bit more about that. I also think there's something really valuable about going with the flow. Now, I think going with the flow has had a bit of a bad press. So I think the more in which we're able to go with the flow, recognize the flow and go along with it, maybe that's the way in which we allow luck to enter into our lives. And then the final part I cryptically call Circus Accidit, or Accidit. I didn't study Latin at school, but I believe it's Latin, and there's a slight little clue there in the corner of the screen for what that supposedly means. To recognizing that bad things do happen, and the more in which we can manage those and work with them, the better. So in terms of where you might be able to find out more about this, so you can, I know these links are here, you're not going to maybe take them off the screen here. I can post them into the chat maybe during the panel discussion. But even on my blog space, there's something where I've put some recordings from some research we did a few years ago. They're freely available, so look at that to see if these are ideas you can explore yourself. There is a LinkedIn group, and we develop things further in terms of digital and mobile. So kind of looking at these ways in which you almost could have an app to help you explore your own luck experiences. So the final moments then, just thinking, well, how do I apply all this to myself then? So as I said, embrace luck, recognize that in everything that we do, it's like we're saying, embracing change, embracing the moment. Luck is an important part of life. The more we can acknowledge and embrace that, the better. Accept change rather than resisting it. We often say whatever we resist persists. So, be able to accept that. Be optimistic. So expect things to go well, because that will actually change your own behaviors and will increase the likelihood of it going well anyway, in many cases. There's research that's suggesting having more relaxed and open attitudes. Again, so the mindfulness work can help one be relaxing. That helps us notice opportunities. So maybe build upon those opportunities where things can go in our favor, and indeed make opportunities, do things to actually increase. So maybe at sometimes taking some kinds of risks, which I'll say about in a second. Appreciate, it's the butterfly effect, that small things can have big effects. Sometimes those risks we take and seem we want to take aren't really risks at all. They're just maybe putting ourselves outside of our comfort zone, exploring our curiosity, trying to find things out, learn from our mistakes. So again, I put mistakes in inverted commas, though they're just all part of the learning. Trust and unplanned events. That to me is a really important one there, is recognizing that unplanned events do happen. And sometimes they can be there that they take you where you need to be, not where you expect it to be, and that's really important. And the final one, bit that kind of intriguing there, be resilient. We'll explore in the panel discussion what we might mean by that, but ways in which we can recognize that when things don't go well, we can still learn from that and move forward. If you want to read any more, I'm not saying you would do, those first 2 references here are those books I mentioned. The third was my own PhD. I can't see you reading that one, The very final one is the book by Richard Wiseman. That's quite a nice, easy read. The one above that is a chapter by myself. And again, if people are interested, I can put a link to that on in the chat. Until that one, I want to say, go look yourself. Happy to pick up more questions about it and see how these ideas around luck may help us understand resilience as well. So thank you for that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. What a great opening to today's session. Now, we're quite lucky because Matthew is going to be staying with us and joining us for the panel discussion that's coming up shortly. So let's keep things moving along. And I would now like to introduce you to my colleague, Jamie Wharf, who is going to lead you through the panel discussion for the next 15 to 20 minutes. All yours, Jamie.
Thank you, Paul. Wow, what an amazing, amazing keynote. Really, really fantastic. And I think often I've heard people talk about resilience and how being resilient can transform bad luck. And I think there really is some key takeaways in there for Matthew in terms of that notion of we sort of make our own luck, and by being resilient and positive, I can really see how that can sort of lead on. So as with no further ado, I just want to thank you, Matthew, again, just to convey my thanks. That was incredible. And I feel lucky already, just having listened to that first 10 minutes. I'd like to introduce you to our other panelists who are going to be joining us for the next 10 to 20 minutes. And we would really like to get your questions into the chat, because I think it's really important for you to have the opportunity to put your questions to the panel. Some of those questions may get answered in the chat, but we'd also like to put some of those questions at the end to our panelists once we've worked through our pre-arranged questions. So with no further ado, I'd just like to introduce you to our next panelist. So Aishi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course. Good evening, everyone. My name is Aishi Akhtar. I'm a senior billing coordinator in the business management department at Enterprise Holdings. I'm also currently on the Drive editorial board promoting gender diversity and the Race, Religion and Equity Committee at our campus. I joined Enterprise in 2016 as a representative alongside with working at the High Commission for Pakistan in the press office as part-time team member. I graduated from Roehampton University, studied journalism, media and culture. Journalism opened a range of possibilities for me. It gave me the confidence to voice opinions on matters such as diversity, inclusion and equity.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aishi, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you throughout the panel. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce you to is Teresa. Teresa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Theresa Corbett. I'm a psychologist and a lecturer in psychology from Solent University in Southampton. My research focuses on health psychology, which is an area of psychology that looks at how people cope with and manage their health. And how they adapt to different diagnoses and things like that. So I've done a lot of work with cancer survivors, and more recently I've been working with older adults and learning how they cope with having multiple long-term conditions and where things like resilience comes into that coping process as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Dr. Teresa. And obviously we've got Matthew joining us as well for the panel discussion. So the first question I'd like to put to yourself, Dr. Teresa, and it's all about resilience. So we've sort of touched upon that resilience, and I think after the year we've all experienced, I think we can all say we've taken a little bit of solace in our own resilience. But I guess to start off the session, we need to understand what resilience is and how that can play out in different ways to different people. So first question to yourself, Dr. Could you define resilience for us and just sort of open up the sort of panel and put the context on the topic?
Yeah, so resilience is basically a human capacity to overcome difficulties, kind of to be able to bounce back when faced with a stressor or when faced with adversity. It's not a fixed, static personality trait that you have or you don't have. People can thrive in some situations and yet struggle in other situations. It helps us to buffer against negative events and can be linked to things that we might have heard of, like hardiness, resourcefulness, grit. It involves being adaptive and being flexible, And I think, you know, I've often heard the analogy of kind of a willow tree bending rather than breaking in response to the elements and the difficulties that people face. So from my research and from other research, we found that, you know, when confronted with adversities, most people can be in different situations remarkably resilient and even surprise themselves. And a lot of psychological research now tries to understand why some people are able to withstand or even thrive on that pressure that they experience in their lives.
Fantastic, and I think I really like that analogy of the willow tree sort of bending in the wind as opposed to snapping. I think that those winds of change that we've all sort of been through, and the winds of change no doubt we'll experience in our sort of future careers, I think that's a really good positive way of looking at resilience and how to deal with it. So thank you very much. I think it's a really great point to get across to open up the discussions. So the next question I'd like to put to Aishi. Now, Aishi, you recently presented in an all-company meeting on a virtual platform to a large audience, and you spoke about resilience yourself personally and your sort of journey. So the question I'd like to ask you, Aishi, is how has resilience and being resilient helped you and sort of molded and shaped your career up to now?
Building resilience was a personal journey for me. It took reflection, time, practice, and most importantly, a lot of patience. When it comes to climbing the professional jungle gym, you will often be held back by your own insecurities, gaps for improvement in your work, or what if I do not have the right experience or knowledge, all these questions clouding your mind. And the number one reason for people to shy away from raising any queries is the fear of rejection, as nobody likes to hear the word no as an answer, and as a result, we avoid it altogether, right? So having raised in a culture where asking was either a sign of weakness or a lack of intelligence, or a sign of being stubborn or too high maintenance, I challenged myself to raise my resilience by practicing seeking for opportunities which challenged me to think and act outside the box. I encouraged to put myself in situations that lay outside my comfort zone. Often I felt incompetent and questioned my lack of motivation, especially when I had occasional dips, detours, and plenty of dead ends that derailed my confidence. But not once I apologized for putting myself forward for opportunities, was because the lesson I learned was to only focus on my personal development and what I can do to manage the situation. I also learned that drawing comparisons to others and their circumstances would only create negative feelings. And there were moments where I did not know the outcome, as I had been rejected time and time again, especially in internal interviews. But watching my colleagues rise the ranks, I often questioned what if I was wasting time and effort, but I wasn't wasting time. I was preparing myself for the right moment. And I felt like I've literally failed repeatedly in my career. And that's the reason why I thrive today. My experiences have actually aided my motivation. Resilience is all about bouncing back, not once, not twice, not even 3 times, but time and time again. And my presentation at the all-company meeting you mentioned was a testimony to that. I have grown immensely from my experiences, and I have now become motivated by my challenges and learned from the most challenging experts of my experiences. I recognize that the feeling of frustration and being stuck in a limbo can actually be turned into opportunities that have led me to this very moment.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much for such a personal response, and what a fantastic response it was. And I think we can all take something from Aishi, that ability to bounce back after those after sort of stumbling blocks and knockbacks, and seeing that as a positive thing. So I think that's a really personal and powerful message that you've just shared there with the audience. So thank you so much for that. That was incredible, and we could all learn a lot from your story. Okay, fantastic. So the next question I've got, I'd like to put to Matthew and bring Matthew back in. Now, during your keynote, Matthew, you spoke about career progressions perhaps not being so linear as perhaps they used to be, and in fact, you could almost look at a career journey as being a little bit more messy and a bit more kind of all over the place. So if you were talking to somebody who was just starting out on their career, and you were going to advise them and help them around that resilience and lucky piece, and how to sort of create your own sort of lucky environment to build resilience to help that career kickstart, what kind of advice would you give somebody in that situation?
Good question, and I want to go straight to thinking about one's own strengths. So again, so it's not something I touched upon actually in the talk, but in positive psychology, one of the approaches has been kind of around strengths-based work. So the more we're able to recognize our own strengths, the better. Now, important to recognize what we mean by strengths. It's not just about those things we're really good at. A really important thing is things that energize us. So what do we get energy from? Things we enjoy doing. And in some ways it's caught up in the phrase, which again makes it sound really simple. I think the more we can keep these ideas in our mind as we progress. So the phrase is, do what you love what you do, which you might hear come back again and again. And it's not easy to think. Well, it sounds easier said than done, and sometimes it is. But if you can recognize, well, what are the things that you love to do? What do you enjoy doing? And these are the kinds of things where you kind of get lost in the moment, where you feel the most authentic you. The more you're able to bring those kinds of energies to whatever you're doing, then I think you're more likely to be resilient. You know, it naturally follows, because you're doing the things you enjoy doing. You're going to have to recognize that there are things that will happen which will be beyond your control, that you might have not wanted to happen. But I think the people who tend to be more successful are generally more able to accept that more quickly. And it's not necessarily denying it. If you're frustrated or fed up that you didn't get a job or something, you go, well, it's not pretending that, oh, that's great, that's really good news. It's, no, be fed up, be angry, be annoyed, be whatever. But the quicker you can move from that emotion into, okay, what can I learn from this? You know, what can I do better next time? And even things like ways of thinking, you know, then it wasn't the right job for you, you know, because there was obviously somebody else in the pool that was a better fit. There'll be another job out there which more suits you. So the more you can keep thinking like that, again, you're more persistent and you will find a job that suits you. And hopefully, again, you can be one of these people that, as much as possible, you're doing things that you love to do, you know, and you enjoy it, which is great, which is what we all aim to do, really, basically. So something along those lines.
Fantastic, Matthew. And that puts a smile on my face, because when we look at ourselves in certain situations, I think we all know we perform best when we're feeling good about the things we're doing, because it sort of aligns with our strengths. But I think we know we perform well, we enjoy ourselves, but we don't necessarily recognise that's because we're playing to our strengths. And I think that's a really powerful point well made. And I think there's some great literature and career advice out there sort of surrounding those strength identity journey. So no, that's really useful, and certainly something I think people will take something from. I'd like to just move on to my next question now. So I'd like to bring Dr. Theresa back in now. And so I'm sat here now and I'm thinking, okay, so I'm going to create my own look. I'm going to really work on learning from my experiences. I'm going to bounce back whenever I hit hardship, but I've not really come across anything that's really got in my way yet to note. Or that's what I'm thinking. So if I was sat there and I'm just sort of looking at this now and thinking, how do I know if I'm resilient or not? I don't feel as though I've been through any forms of hardship yet. So what advice would you give to somebody that maybe wasn't perhaps applying for certain positions that may be out their comfort zones because of that fear of lack of resilience, when in fact they may possess some of those resilience characteristics and traits? So the question being, how can I tell if I'm resilient or not?
So I think, well, first of all, the important thing to remember is that most people experience some difficulties at some point in their lives. I mean, I think, even if it's something as simple as first day of school or starting uni or doing exams for the first time. So it doesn't have to be this kind of a huge life-changing adverse event. Life can be difficult for all different reasons and in different ways. And as you mentioned earlier, even the last year and beyond has been very difficult for a lot of people. So I think it's, you know, through all those events and those life events that people experience, we're learning skills, we're adapting, and we're figuring out how to cope with those difficulties. So you can tell you're being, or you might be resilient by looking at how you've responded to those difficult situations, considering your ability to reflect, to adapt, to learn from the challenges you faced, trying to figure out what went well, why, can you harness those strengths moving forward, or what didn't go well, what did you learn from them? Can you identify things you did or ways of thinking that helped you through? And if you can do that, and if you can identify those things, then that will be kind of resilience in practice and learning that you actually have some resources there already, even if you haven't, you know, gone through a major life stressor.
Fantastic, thank you, Dr. Teresa. And I think the point you make is really poignant, because we often probably have been through some really tough situations, but actually don't recognise that. And I think it's important to hold that thought to make sure we don't sort of hold ourselves back with our applications and career progressions and sort of life choices. No, that's fantastic. If I could I ask the same question to yourself, Matthew? Is there anything you'd like to add to Dr. Teresa's point?
Yes, I think a really nice thing to add to that is the fact that we'll talk about resilience, and it is actually a bit of a messy term, because when we look at it with our sort of master students, we kind of think, well, what's it actually really mean to be resilient? So we've touched upon those internal characteristics, you know, something about ourselves. I think, as Teresa said, that many of us, whether we know it or not, will actually be more resilient than we think we are. Basically, that's one underlying principle. But also, our resilience doesn't just come from ourselves. There's you know, sometimes when we look at the people around us, our environment, there are factors in our outside of us that can also contribute to our resilience. So sometimes even thinking about who else around us can help. That could be family members, friends, and so on. So we don't have to always pick ourselves up, dust ourselves down and carry on without calling to anybody else for help. So sometimes it's about paying attention to things around us which help us. So it's not just, you know, people as well, people, family, friends, but resources. So recognizing what in our environment can also help us get through a situation. And often what we'll find is when we do face it, we'll know what we can draw upon. So I think it's recognizing we are more than we think we are. And in some ways, great if someone feels as though they've been through a life with no hardship at all. I think, as Teresa's pointed out, is that you can even talk about those relatively small events and still see how did you manage to deal with the frustration, deal with the negative emotions, and learn from it and move on. I think those kinds of things would really help.
Fantastic, Matthew. Thank you so much. And that's interesting, because it's almost like a twofold answer. We're getting a real deep dive look into sort of resilience and personal recognition of what we've been through, but also there's some great advice in there in terms of actually answering questions you may come across in an interview situation. And when someone asks about your resilience or your ability to deal with situations, actually talking about some of those points that you raised would be very useful. Fantastic. So the next question I've got is going to be to all panel members, and just looking really for a real short, sharp example, just to sort of just show people the sort of adverse sort of situations we can all face. Now, these are obviously very personal, but I think it shows that things do crop up. So the next question I'm going to ask to all panel members, I'm going to start with Aishi first. And what's the biggest setback you faced in your career to date? And how did it change your future?
I know you said short, but I'm going to dive a little bit more into it. And I have always been very aware of my anxieties, if you haven't noticed already. And I have never liked talking about them when I did not feel too well, or I was always very nervous talking about myself and my struggles. Making them known was always very nerve-wracking, and it still is. But if you're like me, who suffers from severe social anxiety, you would know you become very self-aware. And anxiety is like a magnifying glass. It magnifies, unfortunately, your insecurities. So I had to really coach my mind to find the silver lining in every situation. and use phrases like, this is tough, but I can get through this. Or as our CEO, Chrissy Taylor, would put it, hashtag, you got this. So honestly, it helped me to understand who I am and how I tackle certain situations. And it hasn't been easy, especially when I was being constantly reminded of my weaknesses. But I knew that the feedback I was receiving was valuable. So I now voluntarily ask my colleagues for feedback, whether it be after a presentation, a new job role, or even sometimes even coffee catch-ups. So my main advice to everybody listening and watching is that constructive feedback, it's very important that you know the value of it, because it can really help you in the long run.
Wow, Aishi, what a powerful way to end that your response there. That was fantastic, and thank you so much for such a personal story that you're sharing there. And if I can ask the same question to Dr. Theresa, please.
Yeah, so I went through a really tough time in the final year of my PhD. I had a bad breakup and I was working in an office that was really competitive. It was quite an unhealthy kind of way of working. I was doing an awful lot of work and it was definitely low ebb. I was finding it difficult. I didn't enjoy my work anymore, and everything was kind of falling apart in my life. And I really kind of believe that the kind of saying that, you know, if you keep doing what you're doing, you'll keep getting what you're getting. So I decided I needed a change, and a job came up in Southampton, and everyone told me I was crazy for thinking of applying to it. You know, I had 9 months left to my PhD. I didn't know anyone here. I'm Irish, as you might guess from my accent. And my supervisor told me I'd never submit my thesis if I moved. But I knew kind of that I needed a fresh start. I took the chance. I needed the headspace, and actually not having any friends made it easier to work on my thesis. I had no distractions, but equally I could work on it how I wanted. I didn't have that external pressure and that unhealthy environment. The time alone allowed me to kind of reflect, and I was really proud of my independence, and I'd done what people said I couldn't. So in that first couple of months, I thrived. I ended up submitting my thesis early. I made a group of friends that are still my closest friends. I met my now fiance, and I have a great job that I really enjoy. So no one knew what I needed to get over that period in my life except me. Yeah, and what I did seemed like madness to a lot of people and might not have worked for a lot of people. But I trusted myself. And I think looking back and seeing that I did all of that, you know, moving to a different country, starting a new job, finishing my thesis, you know, it's taught me to push myself, to trust my instinct. And, you know, I can get through tough times, and I will again. So it's been kind of a real learning experience for me.
Wow, thank you again for such a personal and amazing response. And I think that really ties in with that whole "you made your own luck." I mean, look at that amazing journey you've been on from that move to the new job, the new country, all the things that have gone with it. Wow, incredible! That really sort of personifies that sort of phrase. Fantastic. And then last but not least, Matthew, can I bring you in just to get your response on?
Absolutely, yeah, there's some great examples there, and I love that idea of trusting yourself, which is really important. I'm actually going to go back to my A-levels. Actually, I went back and I didn't do so well in my A-levels, so that was one of my big setbacks. And I think back then, and it's still the case, that A-levels are portrayed, at least amongst school, as being the be-all and end-all. You know, how well you do on those determines how well things go beyond that. But I went through a period where I was applying to do accounting and financial management at university, which anybody knows who now would not have been a good fit. But I went back, and then, you know, the sort of resilience really was I had to redo a maths A-level, which I did at college. It was during that time I actually went along to an accounting seminar, which was more aimed at people who are working in a certain area of the career and sort of changing within it. And I had to go in there to sort of find a bit more about careers advice. And the guy at the desk said to me, just checking in, this is no disrespect to any accountants who are listening, but he said, do you want to be an accountant for the next 40 years of your life? I said, well, no, not really. He said, in which case, go away, do a degree in something you're interested in if you're going to do a degree. And then at the end of that, you still want to, you can do exams and so on. So that's when I went and looked at a psychology degree, because I was interested in that. And as I say, you know, many years later, still working in the area of psychology. So in the end, you know, looking back again, you can go, actually, it was a really positive thing. And it actually makes me think of there's a line, I think it's, sometimes not getting what you want is an amazing piece of good luck. And that's said by the Dalai Lama, so somebody who knows his stuff. So I think that's an important one to remember.
Wow, and again, thank you so much, Matthew, for such a personal and positive story in response to the question. I think, again, you just see so many sort of parallels with things we've spoken about this evening. We spoke about do something you love, something you enjoy. It makes it a more positive experience, and that sort of helps you with that resilience piece. And that's fantastic. So I've got 2 more questions. I'm going to turn it back to get some questions from the audience. So I just want to bring Aishi back in just to ask a question around some of the sort of extracurricular activities you do alongside your day job, if you like. So you sit on several diversity and inclusion and wellbeing committees within enterprise. What kind of examples have you seen in terms of how enterprise supports and encourages its employees through both good and bad times?
Well, at Enterprise, we embrace the differences that make us successful and unique, which is why one of our core values is our doors are open. I cannot understate the difference the sport I've had from my colleagues has made to my own career timeline, and they inspired and motivated me to keep going, especially my mentors and allies. They provided me with access to networks for my achievements to the attention of senior level managers and recommended me for many key projects. And if it was not for their support, I would have not realized that whatever I wanted to achieve, there will be countless barriers coasting my competencies. And the only way to get through them is by being confident enough that I can and I will. So definitely the sport around the culture within our company is very supportive for sure.
Fantastic. And I love that I can and I will mentality. I actually taught my 5-year-old daughter to ride her bike with that exact phrase, I can. I think that really puts a smile on my face. And thank you once again, Aishi, for sharing such a personal response to the question. So, and that brings me to my last sort of formal question before we go back to Paul to take some questions from the audience. Now, this is my favourite question. I love asking this question in various ways at the end of these panel sessions. So the question is, what piece of advice would you give your 21-year-old self entering the world of work as a graduate with specific sort of focus on that resilience piece? So if I can start with yourself, Aishi, as I've got you front and centre on my screen.
Well, my only advice would be to follow your curiosities. You will bring passion to your career, which will leave you more fulfilled and content.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Follow your curiosities. I really like that piece of advice. If I could bring Dr. Teresa back in now just to ask the same question.
Yeah, so I'm a sucker for quotes, and one of my favorites is from Arthur Ashe. He says, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. So it's kind of just being adaptive and starting where you are. Like that willow tree as well, you know, kind of bend so you don't break, try to be adaptive and flexible. There's still lots of learning to do. And if you're open to learning and change, you'll be better able to cope with all the ups and downs that life brings. Yeah,
fantastic. And I think we need to get some of these quotes in the chat after we finish the panel session. Because I can't remember them all. I mean, there's been too many good ones. And thank you very much, Dr. Teresa. And Matthew, can I just bring you back in just for that final question?
Yeah, well, I'll end with one which has been a phrase which only for the last few years has become not quite a catchphrase, but from amongst our students when they're working on their dissertation work, because they get lost in it. But a phrase we use a lot of them is to trust the process. And I think it's something saying that back to a 21-year-old self. I think for a while I'd be shrugging rolling my eyes or shrugging my shoulders, saying, I'm not sure what you mean, but recognize there is a process at work and to sort of trust that all things happen in their own time. And maybe even, not quite as much, it all makes sense in the end, but things start to make sense as you get older. So I think realize that there's actually another one in terms of a quote there maybe. I think it's Kierkegaard, so getting clever now in terms of philosophers. But life is something you have to live forward, but only makes sense looking backwards. So I think that's a way of helping that when things happen, is that you will learn from them And it makes those interesting stories later on to say, well, actually, I think someone asked a question in there asking about when you apply for lots of jobs, you're not getting them. When you finally get the one, then you have that story to say, I was resilient, I kept going, I kept trying, I learned from each of these errors and so on. So something about trust the process.
And I think that's such a positive note to end the formal questions on, Matthew. So thank you very much. I think I also picked up in your response there that whole piece about being patient as well, which you mentioned in your keynote, show patience to the process as well. So yeah, fantastic. So I'm going to hand you back now. So I just want to thank you all so much for answering those questions. And I hand you back now to my colleague Paul, and he's going to pick up questions from the audience in the chat. So thank you so much. I'll hand you back to my wonderful colleague Paul.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everyone, for the panel discussion there. We've had a few questions come through the chat, and start with one for you, I think, Dr. Theresa, and then we'll move on if anyone else has any input. But in your introduction, you mentioned that you do a lot around cancer survivorship and dealing with chronic illness and dealing with people that are going through particularly tough times. So with that in mind, can you just talk me through sort of how you coach those type of people through those difficult times, how you look at things like mental health, well-being, mindfulness, and how that can all be linked back to resilience?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, one of the things that I've learned from these people, as I've mentioned, is how amazingly resilient people are and how much they have way more kind of in the tank and way more resources than they realize. And I think that it's just kind of trying to help them to draw on those resources. We think about it a lot in terms of almost like a balancing scale between their resources and their capacity and how that weighs up against the burden or the difficulty they're facing. So it's can we kind of stack the scales in their favor? So really try to harness the resources that they have, and those might be things like focusing on, what social support do you have, what things are going well for you, but also in terms of thinking, trying to get them to focus on the lessons they've learned or reframing the difficulties that they faced in a more positive way, rather than focusing on what they've lost, focusing on kind of how far they've come and what they've gained. A lot of people find it helpful to kind of, almost kind of do those kind of gratitude exercises and think about kind of how lucky they are in comparison to other people. And I think it's one of the things that always surprises me, that when I meet people who seem to have gone through such terrible things, they'll always say, well, at least I didn't go through what this other person went through. So they're always able to kind of find a bit of luck almost and a bit of gratitude in the experiences that they have. So it's about kind of harnessing what people have themselves, rather than kind of trying to build up anything new with them a lot of the time.
Fantastic, thank you. And as we've gone through the session, Matthew's spoken a lot about positive psychology. Theresa, you've used the word positive and positivity there. So, we've all been through some very difficult, some very turbulent times the last 15 months. So how have you managed to stay positive? How have you stayed motivated and made sure that you've got the capacity to get through these difficult times?
Well, for me, in terms of, very honestly, from early in what we now refer to as lockdown 1, back in the day, it seems a long time ago. I was in a position where I was one of those people where recognizing that, well, first of all, again, the gratitude and fortunate, I was in a job where I could work from home. So realizing again, I think this idea of gratitude, we talk about it a few times, but appreciating things that you are unable to do that we often take for granted. And again, I think particularly also given lockdown in general, for everybody, no matter what your situation has been, but to a lesser or greater extent, you will have had some of your liberties taken away, things that you would have just taken for granted. We would never have thought there would have been a point where going on holiday or going around to a friend's house would have been counted as being illegal, or you shouldn't be doing it. You just can't imagine that. So even just now, knowing that when you've got through that in itself is resilience. You've drawn upon things. For me, I used the opportunity to just engage in things again, which I enjoy doing. So I actually started to learn the piano because I've been interested in that, doing it for a while. Also started to learn the guitar, not quite so far with that one, but engaging in things again, which you are looking after your own health and mental health. I think one of the things in terms of mental health is to not take it for granted. Somebody asked a question again in one of the chat there about the link between mental health, is that I think if this last year has taught us anything, is to not take mental health for granted. And I think increasingly now a lot of organizations and so on are realizing that even when people seemingly are getting on and doing really well, actually we're facing lots of challenges. So the more we can be aware of that, I think is really helpful.
Fantastic. Dr. Theresa, Aishi, anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think recognizing that there was difficult days, I think that recognition is really important. And I think Aishi actually kind of mentioned that, you know, that we do have dips, and you're not any less resilient because you have bad days. And kind of recognizing that, you know, it was a bit hard and a bit rubbish sometimes, and really kind of owning that, and kind of, rather than kind of putting this rose-tinted glasses view on it and kind of trying to be overly positive about it, that there were difficult days, and I think recognizing that. And yeah, there was definitely days where I kind of adopted a kind of a, you know, some days good enough is good enough kind of attitude. And some days you just need to get through the day, but it's fine, because taking that time to recover, I guess, and to kind of look after yourself, or take the foot off the pedal, that you'll come back stronger the next day then, you know. If you don't allow yourself to do that sometimes when you're finding things difficult, then you will break, again, to use that analogy. So it is important to kind of just, yeah, to look after yourself and to recognize when things are hard.
I think the only thing I would say is get into the habit of actually praising your own self as well. I think sometimes we're too hard on ourselves. So just take a moment and say, you've done good today, even if the day has been hard, but you at least tried to do something good. So yeah, get into the habit of praising yourself.
Fantastic, thanks. We've had one in the chat box. So can you please give some tips on how to be more resilient at work? So how can you better deal with pressure and the stresses and strains of those that above you maybe put on you?
I'll come back in one initial thought there. So another phrase I think is about letting go. What things can you let go of? I think sometimes the pressures at work we sometimes do put on ourselves. I think if there really is a situation where someone's putting undue pressure on, again, resilience also comes from the people around you. So having conversations with people, whether it's colleagues or others, just be able to talk through your own ideas, I think is a really helpful part of it.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can come in there. So, and again, this is drawing on a conversation I had with a man in his 70s who he'd had different reoccurrences of cancer. And, you know, I was saying to him, you know, are you worried? He had a new diagnosis. And he said, no, I've kind of come to realize that if you can do something about it, why worry? And if you can't do something about it, then why worry? And that was kind of his view. That was his approach. And it's not always as simple as that. But I think there are kind of ways to kind of separate things out into the things you can do things about and the things that you can't do things about. The things that you can't do anything about, you kind of need to learn to cope with, adapt with, live with. And the things that you need to change, you need to figure out kind of how to change them. So I think if you can distinguish between those two things, it can actually be really helpful for building that resilience and learning to cope with difficulties at work as well.
Fantastic, thank you. So last question I'm going to ask, and I appreciate that not one of you is necessarily a careers counsel or anyone who is well versed in giving careers advice, but we're all reading in the press how difficult a time it is for young people and the graduate marketplace, and so many applications per graduate job and that side of things. So what advice would you give to students to keep going, that are applying for multiple roles and feeling that they're not securing interviews, not securing that dream graduate role that they're chasing at the moment?
I would say again, to keep focusing on, don't lose sight of what you'd really like to do. That's really important. At the same time, I think realizing that the route to it is not always the one that we think is the way. So I think exploring other jobs, other opportunities, you can gain amazing skills. And these are, you know, again, it's all relatively temporary in terms of, it's amazing how time moves on and you will learn from things. So I think it's a case of the resilience there is about keep trying, but if it is a case of applying for lots of roles and just getting nowhere, you know, have a look again in terms of, are these particularly roles you really want? You know, focusing that you've got that as a kind of prime motive, and recognize there could be different routes to getting there.
I will definitely echo that and say that it's very, very important for you to have like an open mindset. Don't close your mind to just one thing. We're in a world where there's so much to do, and maybe have more than one career path. That will help you to be more passionate in your life as well. So be creative and have your 9-to-5 job. So explore as much as you can.
Fantastic. Teresa, I think last word goes to you.
Oh gosh, no pressure. I think that people who are graduating now and looking for jobs now, you need to reflect on how far people have come. You know, it's a difficult time to be graduating and looking for a job. We've had COVID, we have an uncertain job market. You've got competition with, you know, really experienced people, you know, maybe going for entry-level roles and things like that. You've had missed networking and college opportunities and meeting people and so on. So I think if you're here and you've graduated in the last couple of years, you should be proud and you should be able to reflect on your resilience, because there's definitely some level of resilience there. And you can always say that you were somebody who graduated during, you know, the pandemic, and you still managed to get through it. And I think that's resilience, you know, a really good example of it.
Fantastic, brilliant. Well, from my standpoint, I would like to thank all of our speakers personally on this session. I thought it's been incredibly insightful. I've taken a lot from it. I am someone like Matthew who absolutely subscribes to the belief of luck, and I like my cricket. And I think it's Geoffrey Boycott who once said, "I don't believe in luck, but that was unlucky." So I think there's a lot more research and things that can be done around luck and the things that it does to lead towards our careers and our opportunities as well. But thank you to all of you. I've enjoyed the session, and yeah, I hope everyone has taken something from it, and we will see you on the next one in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.